Good day and welcome to my talk on women leaders coping with terror and death during COVID-19. My name is Claude-Hélène Mayer and I'm a professor in Industrial and Organisational Psychology at the University of Johannesburg in Johannesburg, South Africa. I very much welcome you to my talk today. So this lecture is all about giving you a little introduction on women and how they coped during COVID-19 with the challenges thereof. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the topic. I will talk a little bit on the theory of terror management, and also I'm going to introduce you to an international research project that we have conducted during this time. We will give you conclusions and also recommendations for theory and practice afterwards in the end of this talk. The talk has been published as a paper in the Humanist Psychologist by Elisa van der Heijden and myself under the title Women Experiencing and Transforming Terror and Death Anxiety During COVID-19. Giving you a little bit of an introduction, it is very important to note that during COVID-19, women have been challenged on different individual as well as societal levels. So women had to deal, for example, with their work, with working from home, with new remote work scenarios, and also at the same time dealing with the families, with friends, with sickness and illness in their context, and they had to cope with all of that at the same time. In comparison, during COVID-19 with men, women were more challenged than men most of the time, and recent research has proven that. So we can say that women have been challenged a lot, but at the same time, research shows us that women also displayed important leadership and leadership coping mechanisms across the different ranges they were actually working in and acting in the societies, in organizations, as well as in their private lives. We can see across the globe that women really tried to lead during COVID-19. So what we were interested in was finding the coping strategies. How did women actually cope during that time? And we could see in the literature that women use different coping strategies when challenged across cultures and also across social strata. Coping, however, we can see across the globe, often involves religion and faith. So a lot of women, and especially also women leaders across cultures, use their religion or their faith to cope with challenging situations. We can also see that women very much focus on their relationship when they are challenged. So relationships and building up strong, trustful relationships is extremely important for women and women leaders to cope with challenges during COVID-19. We can also see that coping is very much relating to meaning making. So a lot of women during COVID-19 ask themselves, what sense does all of that make? What does it make for our societies? What sense does it make for our organizations and on individual levels? What do we learn from this situation of COVID-19 and how it impacted on us and our organizations? So the aim of this presentation is actually to explore how women leaders coped with the immense pressure of COVID-19 across cultures, and also looking at the terror and death anxiety and how they coped with this. That spiked especially during the time of COVID-19. So this was our interest, and we tried to find out about this by conducting research across cultures with women and women leaders. Within our research, we used the theory of terror management, and we wanted to find out what do people actually do according to the theory to become immortal, or at least to think they do. So the terror management theory has been around for quite some time. It was originating in the 1917s, and Ernest Becker was actually a pioneer in terror management theory. And he found out that a lot of human actions and interactions actually serve to avoid death, and especially not only death, but also the anxiety and the terror that death can cause within our mind and our mindsets. So there is a question out there in terror management theory asking, do you think that all human behaviors are really motivated by fear and denial of death? The only certainty is in life is death. That is what the theory says. So that is almost certain, and individuals have to deal with this fact. So further on, the theory of terror management says that death consciousness represents a potential for paralyzing terror. So if we think about death, or if we see death, or if we are threatened by potential death scenarios, usually we become paralyzed and we have to become conscious of the fact that everybody will die one day. Without controlling this anxiety or terror, human life would be unsustainable. So if we are aware every day, yes, to a certain extent, we can conduct our life differently in the mirror that death gives us. But at the same time, we cannot function on a daily basis effectively and efficiently when we always think about death and when we are anxious about it on a strong level. So every human being, therefore, develops ways and coping mechanisms and actually means to symbolically ward off their vulnerability and their mortality. So to not always think about death, we do certain things. A basic question of terror management theory is, how do we now cope with the fear that we are transient and cannot escape death? And surely there are different answers to that on individual, but also on cultural levels. The theory of terror management offers two symbolic means of self-preservation. So on the one hand, the cultural worldview is a fear buffer according to different theorists. They say that the function of culture is to actually minimize the fear that stems from the awareness of vulnerability and finitude. And this is done in two different ways. For the first one, by filling the world with order, with permanence, and with meaning. So if we become anxious about death, we start trying to construct meaning all around. We try to put an order in place to be secure and safe of what our next steps are. And secondly, it is done by ultimately constructing the hope of transcendence and one's own spiritual existence. So we are looking at models of transcendence and also spiritual existence. And we are constructing our religions, our faith, and our belief systems around that. So these are two aspects how the first symbolic means of self-preservation is constructed. Further, all cultures, it is said, contain standards of certain kind of behavior to live a valuable life and the reference to immortality. If one really respects the standards, one receives self-respect and protection, and that is usually promised by your culture. So one's self-worth is tied to that culture, and as soon as one's culture is threatened, it must be defended. The second symbolic means of self-preservation is about the fear of death, which is seen as the fundamental driving force behind the need for self-respect. So self-esteem and self-respect is the emotional manifestation of the instinct for self-preservation. Thus, all goals serve self-preservation, according to the theory. And not everything that people do directly serves self-preservation, but it does also serve self-respect when, for example, someone puts oneself in danger or even to gain recognition. So self-respect is one of the fundamental aspects of the theory of terror management. Also, in order to maintain self-esteem and self-respect, values are thought that correspond to the cultural context. So usually when we believe in our values and in our cultures and we stand in for those values and cultural aspects, this is a reaffirmation of our self-respect and self-esteem. And it gives us security and also safety, a feeling at least of safety. If one meets these standards, self-esteem and thus the second fear buffer are strengthened. As a result, existential dilemmas are usually not even perceived. So if we are thinking about existential aspects such as life and death, we are not threatened by them, usually when we have got a strong value system that is strongly anchored in our cultural and social systems. In the other case, fear is released and the question of meaning and religion is raised. So if we are actually feeling threatened by death, we usually tend to look at our different spiritual aspects. Effects of death anxiety, when we are looking into them, the induced fear of one's own death can lead to different kind of actions and also mindsets. Often great importance is attached to adhering to the standards of one's own culture, as we have recognized before. So it leads often to an identification with one's own group, and the in-group feeling really increases, and people tend to turn to their own language and a cultural group. There is a clear rejection of other groups, and people usually become quite critical about out-group scenarios. Further, it increases feelings of togetherness with the own group and people who speak the same language and value the same cultural aspects and values. And finally, it increases one's willingness to help others. And we can see that usually when people feel threatened by death, they try to help others more and they value the value of altruism also more. It becomes stronger. Now, introducing you to our research project, our research methodology was postmodernistic. It was a qualitative research study, and we used a phenomenological research approach. So we used a purposeful and snowball sampling, and we wanted to focus on women and especially women leaders, and we used qualitative questionnaires that could be filled in over a certain amount of time. So in the end, 14 women got into contact with us from 10 different countries, and they were of the age 22 to 81 years old, and they were extremely interested in participating and volunteering in our research project. So having been impacted by COVID-19 themselves was one criteria for them to really come into our research project. So they should have had an experience themselves with COVID-19 or within their family or their friends. They had to be women in leadership positions and they had to be in a minimum of 18 years old. So we wanted to find out how did they actually experience COVID-19 and how did they deal with death and the fear of death. So in the beginning, we also asked them if they could please refer to how they managed to deal with COVID-19 and this strain and stress they had experienced during the time. So they said that especially faith, religion, and spirituality helped them, relationships with family and friends, and especially trustful relationships, meaning-making, and defining or redefining even the purpose in life, and self-transformation. So when we are looking a little bit deeper into these 4 topics, we can see that 8 women reported, for example, on faith out of 16. So they, for example, said, I am a person of faith. I'm Catholic. My faith gives me support, strength, and confidence. That was a German 24 years old woman. A 58-year-old US American said, I believe that all deaths are predestined. So while waiting for the ambulance, and she was sick of COVID-19, a Canadian 40-year-old woman said, I told God I was prepared to die. Also, I bore the weight of worry alone in order to spare my loved ones. So this woman decided not to call anyone so that nobody got worried about her situation she was in, and she called the ambulance herself. So she decided to be alone with her death or potential death. So the findings on relationships show that the majority, 12 out of 16 women, actually emphasized how their close relationships supported them. One German 22-year-old woman said, "My family and friends took great care of me and were concerned about my health. It was good to know that so many people were actually there for me." And she explained within her interview how they cared for her and how it supported and helped her to cope with the situation. The feeling of not being alone, although of being alone whilst potentially dying. Then we could find several findings on meaning making. And 6 women speak strongly about their meaning making experience during COVID-19 and how it actually helped them to overcome their fear of death. A Canadian 58-year-old woman said, "On a spiritual level, I understood the meaning behind my illness, and that helped me cope. I am more open to receiving and feeling love. I feel my sense of belonging in the world and purpose more clearly." And she explained later in her interview that she really had the feeling that she has redefined herself through the process of meaning making and redoing it. "I feel more accepting regarding my life. I've slowed down. I am not as busy anymore." So she could also take a break with regard to COVID-19 and looking at her purpose in life and becoming more mindful. And that really helped her to overcome the fear of death. "I have often asked myself," says a German 24-year-old woman, "what is the point of all this? Maybe we are rethinking our way of life, learning to pause. I reorientate myself and to reorientate ourselves, to live more in solidarity. I don't know yet." So this woman shows a lot of self-reflection, trying to find the meaning behind COVID-19 on a societal level, but also on a group level and on her individual level. "I mainly know my questions, but not the answers." So she is left actually in the dark with her own reflections because she has to do further research within herself what COVID-19 actually meant to her and how it impacted on her meaning making. However, it steered a lot of self-reflection, and that helped her to also reflect upon life and death and a potential death that could be around the corner all the time. So our findings on self-transformation show also some of the quotes. A 65-year-old South African says, "The purpose of the virus is to open up perceptions and views and to show the world in a new light." So showing the world in a new light for this South African interviewee actually meant looking at herself and transforming herself, finding a new meaning and getting into a developmental and growth process. And this is what she explains based on that statement within her interview. A 40-year-old US American says, after we've asked her about her experience with COVID-19 and death anxiety, "I have more gratitude for everyday things." So she explained she actually transformed by not looking at the big things that might be out there in the future, by actually looking at the small things that were around. An Australian 55-year-old woman said, "I have learned not to take things for granted, learned how privileged I am, and have been through this situation. I have a job, a house, supportive partner, no children or other family commitments to worry about, how much exercise keeps me physically and mentally healthy, and to reduce my commitments and activities in the future." So this woman actually reflected on her own things in her life that really helped her and made her feel gratitude and learn about her privileges in her life so that she could really deal better with the situation. When we are looking at the discussion and our findings and results with regard to our literature review, we can see that women we have interviewed actually accepted the situation of COVID-19, especially when they were somehow involved in it, using it to their increase of awareness, but also of consciousness, of self and of others. Reflection was a very big issue in our data set. And we can see that the woman described key concepts of meaning making, of self-transcendence, which we could also find in the humanistic existential literature. And we can see that COVID-19 actually steered to look at humanistic values and existential issues to cope and deal with them on a strength-based level. We can also see that by increasing conscious awareness in the challenging situation, women become more self-reflective, not only with regard to their own life, but also with regard to their social interactions, with regard to their social context and their cultural norms and values. So that is a very strong aspect of COVID-19 challenges and coping mechanisms. Further, we can see women make conscious decisions to create meaning and to create a new life, a coherent life within realistic limitations. So when they had a close to death experience, they became very realistic about the situation, and they thought of others and they thought of themselves, and they made the decision to go through the situation, either by themselves or with others, but in a very conscious manner. For some women, the pandemic-ridden situation does not carry meaning, or they struggle to create meaning, and they keep on asking themselves, what actually is this all about? And how do I use that for my own transformation? How do I use it to move forward in life? We can see a lot of these issues that are reflected in our findings. We can also see them being very much reflected within the theoretical discourse. The majority of women experienced a lot of emotions like sadness, which were followed later by fear for themselves, their own death, and the death of others especially. So a lot of our women highlighted that they were actually extremely worried about their families and friends, even more than about themselves, because they wouldn't want and didn't want to deal with the loss through COVID-19. The concern for others, as expressed in the findings, seems to be stronger than the concern for the self. And the unavoidable death toll with which women had to cope during COVID-19 evoked a lot of feelings of sadness, of fear, of anxiety, but also huge concern, a kind of shock state some of our interviewees describe, and it has been described also in the literature. People who survived, we can see in the literature, feel ashamed often or even guilty. And also several of the women who had lost someone during COVID-19 who was close to them showed that they felt guilty and ashamed about the whole situation, and they felt hopeless. At the same time, the findings support the terror management theory proposal that empathy and compassion are important in dealing with death and death anxiety. So empathy and compassion, looking to help others and to offer help to others, really helps to deal with death anxiety. So when we are now looking at terror management in African context, we can really say that terror management theory is really under-researched in African samples and in African context. And we really suggest that researching terror management theory in culture-specific and non-weird samples is actually extremely important so that the intercultural and cross-cultural discourses on terror management theory could really improve and grow. So learnings from sub-Saharan African contexts and how to deal with the threat of life and death could actually shed new light on the international and especially often Western and Westernized research on terror management. We could also highlight the gender-related insights from women of different intersectionalities in African contexts, of different background, of different ethnic groups, of different language groups, could really help to really understand the experiences and also the philosophies of life and death in the context of COVID-19 and their coping mechanisms more in depth. Coming to our conclusion and recommendation, we can say that it is extraordinary how women apply their coping strategies, activate their resources they've got, especially their faith, their religion, and their interrelationships, and how they stayed mentally healthy within COVID-19 scenarios. They are conscious of their death anxiety and have become more conscious through COVID-19, and they use different ways to grow and develop through it, and on individual, societal, and human levels. Future research should focus on women leaders across the African continent and their coping strategies, and later on compare them to Western approaches of death anxiety management. On a more practical note, training and coaching for women leaders should be offered to deal with death threats and the ways to cope with death anxiety. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have got a little bit of an insight into our topic of women leaders coping with death anxiety in and during COVID-19.